Sean here, this time recording the video from Carnival Splendor. I've got a Mango Magic that I've just ordered from the Red Frog Rum Bar, and this is absolutely delicious. I wasn't sure if I was going to record a video while I'm on mostly holiday mode, but I thought I would anyway. So today, what I'm going to be talking about are nursing home RADs and refundable accommodation deposits. They used to be bonds back in the olden days. Now those bonds are gone, and now people talk about RADs, which, look, it can be a bit more complex, but they're just structured completely differently. So previously with the old bonds, the prices would just come out of nowhere, and they'd generally be lower amounts. But now what we've found are that basically with refundable accommodation deposits, most of them are around that $500,000 to $800,000 mark, roughly. And the way I explain it is, it's basically the cost of the room. Everything in aged care, I usually explain them like it's a one-bedroom apartment. That's the price of it. And you can buy it, you can rent it. Now, when it comes to the cost of that room, if it's anything more than $550,000, then the nursing home itself will actually have to go seek approval from the, I think it's the Quality Commissioner, whatever it is. But what we find is most of them are, again, what I mentioned in that price point. And when it comes down to that, though, the most common misconception in aged care is that you actually need to have $500,000 or $800,000 in order to move into that room. But that's just not the case, because just like with a normal apartment, if I wanted to move into a $550,000 apartment, of course I could. If I had a cool $550 sitting around in cash, I could go buy the thing. But what I'm also able to do is rent the apartment. I've got people all around me on the cruise ship. It's awesome. So, and the way the rent is set is that there's this thing called an MPIR, which is the aged care interest rate. Now, that is currently, as of now, which is August 2023, set at 7.9%. 2 years ago, it was around 4%, and it was fairly low. And what that varies on is basically based on what the Australian Tax Office general interest charge is, plus 3%. So we're going to expect to see that go up and up. But the reason that's relevant is that the way they calculate the rents. So let's go back to a one-bedroom apartment. If you were going to rent that apartment, then the way they calculate the rent for aged care homes is, if it's a $500,000 room, let's just call it 8%, you basically have to pay 8% of that annually. So, and like with anything, rent money is dead money. So if you're quite happy to pay that rent, then no stress at all. You don't have to sell your home. But I guess what happens is that the way to look at it is that if you do keep your home, it's almost like you're renting a second apartment. And there's some people who might have the cash, shares, super, anything else that they can afford that. They might even have income streams, whatever. For people like that, great. But for other people who don't necessarily have all of the liquid funds available, then they have to give some serious thought to either funding, buying that aged care home themselves, or paying the rent, or seeking family assistance. And we're going to go into what can happen. So, quick look at my notes. And another quick thing to add is that that's also the big part of why an age pension will not always cover someone's complete nursing home costs, because the RAD is the RAD or the DAP, that basically pays for the rent or purchase of the room. But you've still got utilities, you've got nursing staff 24/7, you've got your food bills, you've got everything else that comes in. So even in the same way that if you were renting or buying a one-bedroom apartment or a holiday home, you'd have a whole bunch of other expenses that would come up. So if you can fund that, you're going to need to find a way to fund those from whatever expenses that you might have. Now, pros and cons. So when people see that, a lot of people do feel as if they are forced to sell the home, and I've covered why that's not the case. But in terms of some pros and cons, basically anything that you don't pay is subject to an 8% interest rate. So if I take off all of my emotional hats purely in a financial planner context and then say from a numbers perspective, it's almost like you're taking a loan from the aged care facility at 8%. For that to make sense on a financial basis, you have to earn more than that elsewhere. So for most people, it makes more sense to cash out their investments because the current bank interest rates, even now, are about the 4 to 5% that they're receiving. And when it comes to shares, over the long term, sure, you might expect 8 to 10%, but that's often over a 7 to 10 year time frame, which when it comes to aged care, the average length of stay that we're dealing with is typically about 2.5 years. And look, like with any average, I always use the example of if in a standard pub in Melbourne or Sydney, let's say, the average wage might be, let's call it $100,000. Kerry Packer walks into a beer, the average wage suddenly becomes $10 million. So the average isn't always a great thing to go off, but the point is that we are looking at a shorter time frame when it comes to aged care. So in terms of the pros, firstly, it's like earning 8%, and anything that you put into that RAD or bond is covered by a government guarantee. And you can't find that risk-free 8% return anywhere. I'm yet to see one. And anything that you put in is also exempt for the purposes of the age pension, but not for the purposes of aged care. But that's for means testing. That's a whole separate video altogether. So what a lot of people find is that it often financially makes most sense to put the money into the RAD or the bond. And where they don't want to sell the family home, though, sometimes I do get this common question. Would it make sense for a family member to put money into the RAD? Because sometimes I'll get a daughter who might say, look, I've got $500,000 sitting around in a term deposit. So would it make sense for me to take it at 4% and stop mum and dad from paying 8%? Now, whilst that can make sense, a few things happen. Firstly, the RAD is not liquid. Once you put money in, it's basically there with the nursing home until you leave the facility. Now, obviously, and what does leave the facility mean? For some people, that is that they passed away, probably most common. But the second one also is that they could actually just leave the facility. The facility might close, they might not like it. And unlike with the old bonds where there were retentions and other charges that came out, with the RAD, 100% of it has to be refunded back to that person within 14 days. And when it comes to someone passing away, after they get the grant of probate, they've got 14 days to give the RAD back to the estate to be distributed along with the will's wishes. And that's where things can get really tricky. That when family members put money into a RAD, then suddenly we're looking at, can someone legally enter into a loan agreement with an estate down the track? What if the will says that the proceeds are going to the RSPCA or distributed evenly amongst all of the children and only one person made it? Basically, it opens up a legal nightmare that I very rarely see solved, and it often goes in the too hard basket, because whilst it remains that exemption for age pension purposes, what it also does is it drives up the aged care means tested fee. Again, another video. Or you can watch my other financial webinar that I delivered on that, which is the means tested care fee in far more depth. So those are the financial reasons. So in a nutshell, if I really boil it down, if I look at it from the purely financial perspective, paying the RAD means that you are now effectively saving yourself an 8% loan. And if you can answer the question, would you borrow money from the Commonwealth Bank or anyone else at 8%? If the answer is no, it generally financially makes sense to pay a RAD. Where it stops making as much sense to pay a RAD for some people is when we more get into some of the emotional considerations that come into it. Because for most people that I deal with, paying the RAD in full will typically require sale of the family home. And whilst it's all well and good for me to do a financial strategy that shows this is optimal, there's a few other things that can come into this. Now, most family homes are full of family possessions, heirlooms, memories. They're tightly held. People often bought them at tough times. And then with the series of changes that occur, like if mum or dad has just moved into an aged care facility, then it's already so unstable as it is. And then just to sell their home on top of it is just, it can be a almost emotionally traumatizing experience for some, which causes a lot of reluctance to sell the home. So that's why a lot of people do actually end up paying that DAP interest. But then what I like to think about is that let's take the finances out of it now. Obviously, we have to find a way to do it, but now we're doing this for emotional reasons, not for financial reasons. And that changes everything with how we approach it. So that's one of the other ones now. And sometimes where the other two main scenarios I get where people don't pay where they don't pay the RAD, where they can, is one, look, if the person has got a really short life expectancy and it might have been a very short notice entry into aged care, then there are times like that where even if it's financially optimal, we don't want to deal with the rigmarole of dealing with all of this in the estate and lawyers. It's easier just to deal with it all in one. So times like that, we might actually not pay the RAD. And in other cases where people have more complex estate planning through trust structures, or they've got such investments that might have significant capital gains tax benefits or even implications of doing things, and by paying a RAD will completely change all in one, So times like that, we might actually not pay the RAD. And in other cases where people have more complex estate planning through trust structures, or they've got such investments that might have significant capital gains tax benefits and or even implications of doing things, and by paying a RAD will completely change their estate planning. Cases like that, we might also choose not to pay that aged care RAD. And in situations like that, we're quite happy to pay the DAP, and we just see that, I know it puts it really bluntly, but almost like just the cost of doing business. So, just looking at my notes now, I think I've covered most of my points, but the RAD or the DAP, it's really important to get your head around because it's quite a big fee that comes in, and it's typically the first thing that will get quoted to you when you walk into a nursing home, that they'll usually tell you this is a $500,000 facility, and they'll quote the RADs, the DAPs, and people often feel as if they're being channeled into a certain decision point. But the truth is, it's all consumer law. So, it's consumer rights. You can choose how much you pay into that RAD or not pay into that RAD. But just know that you are going to have to pay the interest if you choose not to pay that. And of course, there are ways that you can defer it, and there's a whole bunch of different options out there as a planning consideration. So, bit of a longer video. So now we're looking at about 11 minutes. We've covered a lot, but certainly not exhaustive. If it comes down to it, make sure that you get proper advice about someone who understands these in full. But in the meantime, I barely even had a sip of this. So have a great one. I'm going to continue to enjoy the rest of my holiday and have more of this. Catch you on the other side.